I think we can begin. I'm very pleased to welcome tonight Harry Francis Mallgrave. A little background on him. He is an architect, scholar, editor, and retired professor of history and theory at the Illinois Institute of Technology. After several years in architectural practice, he received his PhD in architecture from the University of Pennsylvania. His dissertation topic culminated in the intellectual biography Godfrey Semper, Architect of the 19th Century, which won the prestigious Alice Davis Hitchcock Award from the American Society of Architectural Historians. More recently, Harry was awarded an honorary fellowship from the Royal Institute of British Architects. He has written numerous books and articles on the history and theory of architecture, including, I'm going to go through these: Empathy, Form, and Space, Problems in German Aesthetics, Architectural Theory, Volume 1, an anthology from Vitruvius to 1870, Architectural Theory, Volume 2, an anthology from 1871 to 2005, Modern Architectural Theory, a historical survey, 1673 to 1968, and an introduction to architectural theory, 1968 to the present. I first met Harry in 2009. I was considering going back and getting my master's degree, and I talked to the dean of IIT. That's where I got my bachelor's degree, and she seemed open to me coming back. But I told her I had one caveat, and that was I didn't think I could work with somebody younger than me. And she said, I think you should go talk to Harry Mallgrave. And I did. And I ended up taking all my classes with Harry. And Harry is primarily a historian, which means, forgive me if I'm saying things that you don't agree with, but I think a good historian cannot have a point of view. If he has a point of view, if he has an agenda, I think he's no longer a historian, he becomes a critic. And Harry's a very good historian. Having said that, I'm going to read a quote that was on one of the syllabus that he gave me. This is a quote from Steven Pinker from the book he authored, The Blank Slate. It goes out, this is sort of paraphrased. There exists the erroneous belief that human tastes are reversible cultural preferences, which has led some planners to write off people's enjoyment of ornament, natural light, and human scale, and force millions of people to live in drab cement boxes. And that gave me a hint maybe where Harry's heart actually was. I thought it was interesting that if somebody had that point of view, that they ended up at the Illinois Institute of Technology. How do you bring in that kind of idea to a school that prides itself on science and technology? And so what Harry did, I thought was ingenious. He actually wrote 2 books, both based on science and technology, recent research into the workings of the human brain. And beginning with his first book, The Architect's Brain, Neuroscience, Creativity, and Architecture, and more recently followed up with Architecture and Embodiment, the implications of the new sciences and humanities for design. Professor Mallgrave addresses the emotional processes of embodied simulation, which rejects overly conceptualized approaches to theory and the objectification of design, which is viewing buildings as objects, and argues for a return to the focus of design to where it formerly resided, the human experience of inhabiting the world. And so with that, I'd like everyone to welcome Professor Mallgrave.
Thank you. Okay, is it on now? Okay, everyone can hear me? I first of all just want to express my gratitude to be able to come to Notre Dame finally. When I graduated from high school many years ago, the mid-1960s, and I would say about a quarter of my class came out to South Bend to attend college. So I'm almost a domer in a way, but not quite. But in any case, when I originally was asked about 3 months ago for a title for this, I gave this particular title, and I'm going to be talking about this as far as the content of it. But as I began to work on the project over the last 3 or 4 weeks, I came up with another title, which is a little sort of confrontational, and it's also somewhat of an embarrassment in the sense that I've worked in architectural theory all my life. And as a very slow learner, I finally discovered there was no theory out there. So I can demonstrate that, or I could demonstrate that with the assertion that architecture is filled with opinions, beliefs, approaches, and the like. But I would like to sort of make that point by going to the second part of this proposition, which is that architecture is a practice of culture. And what I would like to do as I go through this is to sort of trace the path of cultural theory into the present day to show why architecture is in fact a practice of culture. If a class of students in anthropology and did not know anything about architecture, and someone gave the students the assignment of looking at buildings like Alberti's church in Rimini and other works, and maybe some of the writings of these people as well, and they asked these students of anthropology what exactly happened here, what was the theoretical basis for this type of building. I think they would tend to answer that obviously Alberti, one of the founding spirits of the Italian Renaissance, was attempting to reclaim Latin culture, classical Latin culture, and he felt that effectively this body of cultural theory had been debased over the course of the Gothic medieval times, and that he had to bring it back, and this was the superior culture that he was aiming for. We could take almost any period of architectural history and really find, from the perspective of anthropology, the fact that all of these debates were cultural debates. This is a plate from David Leroy's plate of the Parthenon. Greece, as you may or may not know, was virtually unknown in an architectural sense until about 1750, when the first Western travelers got entrance to the country and began to sort of revet, first of all, but then Leroy was right on their heels, and he was actually the first to publish this material. And it ignited a real controversy because the Royal Academy of Architecture in France had been set up on Renaissance models, Renaissance textbooks, and since there was no understanding of Greek architecture, the presumption was that Roman culture was the height of classical antiquity. And then suddenly we've got these beliefs that no, it wasn't Latin culture, it was actually Hellenic culture, which is the high point of the classical past. And people like J.J. Winkelmann, for instance, wrote a history of the art of antiquity, where he had three styles, each one getting progressively better until it gets to the fourth style. The height of classical times for Winkelmann was the 2nd century BC, and after that, everything was put into the classification of the art of the imitators, and it was basically snubbed and disregarded as they were far inferior artists because they could not create their own architecture. They simply had to copy what the Greeks had done earlier. But in any case, this plays itself out over the course of the second half of the 18th century. And of course, we have the Piranesi and others who were defending Latin culture. And this debate, incidentally, is what comes down into the United States in the 1790s and early 1800s as people like Benjamin Latrobe and Thomas Jefferson were adopting Greek culture as sort of the ideal of a new democratic country being founded. Now, if we go forward another century, we have a different sort of cultural perspective, and this is really sort of the birth of multiculturalism. And of course, this is a great exhibition which took place in London of the works of all nations in 1851. And this suddenly brought an entirely different perspective to the world, because you could go into one single building and look at the goods from over 100 countries from around the world. You could compare them, study them, and as many people did at the time, concluded that the non-industrial nations actually were producing far better art than the industrialized countries. And of course, this was the crisis of the mid-19th century that would ultimately culminate with the breakdown of historicism later in time. Now, it is not by coincidence, and this is, by the way, 1854, they reconstructed the Crystal Palace. And inside the larger expanded Crystal Palace, they built an entire sort of a set of scale models of architecture like the Alhambra. And this, again, was something very new, that you could walk into a building and explore the various cultures, architectural cultures and otherwise, of different people, and they were side by side. It was not by coincidence that Godfrey Semper, in 1860-63, wrote his book Style in the Technical and Tectonic Arts. And he was there in London. He had actually started this in a theoretical sense prior to coming to London. But he was very much astounded by not only what he saw of the industrialized world. Germany at that time was not quite industrial at this period, but he was also very, very interested in the indigenous arts of the other peoples. And if you go back, I actually at one point translated this book, which is about 1,200 pages. And so I got to know it fairly well. I always saw it from the perspective of an architect as a sort of a stylistic investigation where you have simple motives that how they become expanded and elaborated upon. But if you begin to look at it as a work of cultural theory, it makes a lot more sense. Because when Semper gets to the critical part of the text halfway through the first volume, where he talks about the most essential element of architecture basically ever to appear in architectural history, he begins it not with a discussion of architecture itself, but with a discussion of the violet, blue, saffron yellow patterns woven into the gowns of Ephesian women. And he took that from a fragment of a text that went back to the period of time. And it was from this principle that he developed his notion. The German word is Bekleidung, and the principle that he was after was, the translation of that would simply be a dressing, a garment, a raiment. His argument was essentially, if the Ephesians could design a gown as beautiful as this one, then the architects had to come along and come up with something in order to sort of keep on the same level of the designers elsewhere. Now, just going ahead a few more years, we take Louis Sullivan, and of course he's in that tradition of Emerson, Greenough, and Walt Whitman and others, the transcendentalists. In 1904, 1906, he wrote this book, Democracy, Man's Search, where he was basically he was actually a very good writer. I would highly recommend to read him. He's very sort of entertaining. But his premise in this particular book, again, he doesn't mention the word architecture. His argument is that America has a new democracy. It therefore needs a new style, and this has to be a democratic style. And this was really his lifelong ambition, was to find the proper architectural style to express American democratic culture. And during the same years, between 1904 and 1906, he designed his bank in Owatonna, which I think is really probably his finest work, at least in my eyes, because it really attempted to fulfill the ideas of a democratic institution. The bank vault is exposed to view. There are no private offices hidden away where the bank managers can manipulate people's monies and the like. Everything has to be done in the open in a very large sort of bright hallway. So again, I would say this is another attempt to look at architecture from a cultural perspective. And we can follow this all the way down into the mid-1960s, where we have the so-called countercultural revolution of the period. And here we have the face-off of two books in 1966, one of which the European intellectual, really a defender of high modernism, although he wanted to take it back to a typological language, which went back to an earlier period of time. And we have Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, on the other hand, who are very much casting off high modernism, as it were, and were attempting to espouse what in some cases they actually called pop architecture, looking at the efforts of the pop artists and drawing from everyday life rather than from the sort of historical language of architectural practice. So this is where I want to pivot and begin to look at the cultural theory of the time. Because one of my beliefs is that we're almost still operating on the same sort of cultural principles that really go back to the 60s, and we haven't followed, say, cultural theory very well down to the present. So let me make that case. I just put in the book, Goethe's book, The Interpretation of Cultures. It was published in '73, but most of the essays were written in the early to mid 1960s. And he was probably the foremost cultural anthropologist of the period. He was trained at the University of Chicago. He spent years at Princeton at the Institute for Advanced Studies. And his argument, basically, and this was really the argument of the 60s, was that we are born into the world almost like a computer is born into the world, and then we have the software of the machine coming in, which is culture, which programs how we think, act, and behave. So basically, everything is cultural for Goethe, and biology plays no role at all. And this was not unique to his own point of view. This is really the predominant view of the 1960s, where someone got into these sort of philosophical issues. At the same time, we have these other books beginning to appear, like Audrey's book of 1962, and Desmond Morris's The Naked Ape, which came out, I think, 4 years later, Lorenz's book on aggression. And all of these books were sort of underscoring, they were actually quite popular with the non-academics, but they weren't very popular for the most part within the academic departments, because they contradicted so much what had happened. But basically the argument here is that we're not entirely cultural individuals, that we have a substantial number of instincts and the like that we sort of bring into to our behavior patterns today. Lorenz's book on aggression, again, we had the two catastrophes of World War I and World War II, and there were a lot of discussion on whether aggression, how do we eliminate that as a human instinct. And Lorenz's argument was actually, well, you can't really eliminate it because it's there, but it does serve a larger sort of evolutionary reason for being. Going forward another 10 years, we have what is really going to be the first major assault on traditional cultural theory, which is Edward Wilson's sociobiology. Effectively, his argument is, it's quite simple, that sociology, in his view, was not a science, would never be a science, and all these social sciences that call themselves sciences, they're not sciences because they can't demonstrate or prove anything, any of their presumptions or premises, and that if they're going to become scientists or scientific in their approaches, they should marry with biology, because this way biology can test whatever premises they might have to advance. Well, this very rapidly led to a breakdown of traditional cultural theory, as by the early 1980s, 90s, and even into the present century, we get a series of books relating to gene cultural coevolutionary theories. And I don't need to, what's interesting about this, Durham was an anthropologist at Stanford Richardson, and boy, they're actually both from Stanford as well. One is a biologist and one is an anthropologist. And we start to get these sort of interdisciplinary activities. So I'm going to get to the end of this right here. I just wanted to have this one definition when I say coevolutionary theory. because this is really the essential kind of premise that I want to bring into my talk. This was defined by Wilson and Lumsden back in 1981, and it would still stand today: a complicated, fascinating interaction in which culture is generated and shaped by biological imperatives, while biological traits are simultaneously altered by genetic evolution in response to cultural innovation. Now, since that date, that was 1981, there have been literally probably 10,000 scientific papers and 100 books written on this particular subject. It's gotten into be a very complicated and sophisticated field. I just pulled out one text, which I think has a particular relevance to architecture, and that is this text on niche construction. As you see, it comes out of population biology, which is actually a branch of biology where they look at large statistics and numbers in order to come up with mathematical equations and the like. And the principle here is that organisms interact with environments. They take resources from environments, make micro and macro habitat choices with respect to environments, and by doing all these things, they modify some of the selection pressures present in their own and each other's local environments. Now, this is how I would translate that into architecture. Just as we as designers construct our built environments, so do our built environments reconfigure who we are as human beings. And I think this is probably the most important thing I want to say this evening, because I was trained, and I think as architects in general are trained, of looking at buildings, as objects, and the like. But what we don't really see is that not only are we designing for people, which I think many of us recognize, but we're also designing the people that we're designing for, in a sense. That any modification to an environment, as niche construction theory presumes, will lead to a modification in some way of the organism within that particular habitat. So I just want to recap contemporary gene cultural theory, and then I'll get into architecture. The overriding premise is that the world is not pre-given and later represented in the brain. The human mind emerges from self-organizing biological processes that interconnect the brain, body, and natural and built environments at several levels. And note the levels: genetic, cellular, social, and cultural. Now, this is not biology that I've taken this from. This is actually a philosophical interpretation of all of this material, which has come out of coevolutionary theory. Primarily, Evan Thompson probably has the best book on this. But this is important to see that we're not just organisms interacting with an environment, but in fact, there's an interchange of energies going back and forth, genetically, cellularly, socially, and culturally. And this is, again, this joint notion of gene culture coevolution, the fact that we can't leave out the social and cultural when we get into these other modification factors. In any case, one paper of 2001, Thompson and Francisco Varela, who was a biologist, says if we're going to look at this from a philosophical perspective, there are really sort of three cycles of operation. We have the cycles of organismic regulation of the entire body, which is really the process of homeostasis. When the body goes into an environment, it has to readjust itself to that environment. We have the cycles of sensory motor recoupling between the organism and the environment, and I'll spend some time on that. And then thirdly, we have these cycles of social and cultural interaction. So this is what the premise that I want to bring tonight to architecture is that we in a way we can look at the world in a similar fashion on these particular three levels, and that is human biology in the built environment, how we adjust ourselves in a homeostatic way to the built environment. Secondly, the perceptual and aesthetic experience of design, how we engage and respond to the built environment. And then we have the third sort of socio-cultural dimension. I just put this image in because I really like the image. I think it says a lot about architecture. But I'll go through each of these to give a little bit of an explication of what I mean by them. And I just also, before I do that, I just want to emphasize this, these areas of research and thinking about architecture aren't intended to be sort of deterministic or to be directed towards some end. There's no such thing with the complexity of what we are as human individuals to form any rigid laws that come out of this. But we do have the tools to investigate the body's response to architectural environments today that we never had before. And this is something I think we're going to see a lot more of. Now, I just took this first example of homeostasis. I'm going to just take one example from it. In 1973, a British geographer, J. Appleton, wrote a book called The Experience of Landscape. And one thing that he noted, he went and looked at all the history of landscape painting, and then he looked at the history of landscape gardening. And he saw a remarkable similarity in the basic themes of both. All the landscapes offered this idea of prospect from somewhere looking above, and then you had some notion of refuge, in this case that miniature pantheon in the background. All these images always show low-cut grass, mowed grass within the immediate vicinity, and again that offers you a certain protection, security as it were. Water is always present, that's a daily human need. Trees, but also certain types of trees, especially those that have a large full canopy and they're relatively close to the ground. And so what Appleton did by looking at all these elements, he came up with really two theses, one of which is that we have this proclivity of both prospect and refuge. We pay more for a unit on a higher and a tall building than we do for an area a unit on the lower floor, simply because we have a better prospect, better control, as it were, of our environment. And then, refuge, I think, is fairly self-explanatory. But the other thing that he argued is that there has to be some sort of a biological foundation to these other aspects. Why, cross-culturally, around the globe, we design our parks precisely the same way with precisely the same elements wherever possible. Well, that sort of, that was the 1970s and 1980s. They started doing some research. Some psychologists began to do research on this and discovered that, yeah, people, when they go out for a walk in nature, their blood pressure falls, their heart slows down, their stress tends to fade away, and then if they take a test prior to the walk and then compare it with a similar test at the end of the walk, they always do better at the second test than they do at the first. That there has to be some sort of an explanation for this. Well, in the early 1990s, there was a new area that christened itself as evolutionary psychology, and that was the quotation that Gilbert read from on the high rises and the like. Their argument, their thesis was this: yes, there is a biological foundation, and it's the fact that we spent 2 million years evolving as a creature in the savannas of Eastern Africa, and Eastern Africa has precisely these types of characteristics in terms of the landscape, and that what happened is that we basically cultivated an adaptation in this regard. Well, this was fine as an explanation for that, but more recently, and I can just see what the next slide is before I get to this. More recently, there's actually been some scientific verification. There's been a number of studies, particularly by Japanese neuroscientists, who we're looking at, there's an activity they call it forest bathing, where people take a long weekend, go for a two-day, two-night hike into the forest. And when they come back, he would measure their blood, take blood samples before and after. And what he realized was, or what his experiments demonstrated, that if you spend 2 days in the forest, and this makes sense, we spend our holidays in the forest or at the seashore or someplace natural. But basically what that does is create it increases and say, well, this is where people are going to congregate on the street. We've done that for, in many cases, for half century, and no one congregated there. Not always. There have been some very successful examples, obviously, but at least at least now we can begin to test these notions. Yeah.
What would you suggest architecture schools should consider to revalorize this notion of empathy and Einfühlung? Would that consider kind of enhancing scientific studies of the brain, or would it enhance just kind of studying examples which were then kind of get a much better, a wider range of successful precedents and kind of understand exactly for what reasons?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's actually a question I've given a lot of thought to, and I've spoken with Professor Gorski last night as well. It's almost impossible. When I was at IIT, I was very frustrated. They had a sociology and a psychology and an anthropology department, but they taught nothing of any importance. They were teaching what was the sociology of the 1960s there. You can't really go to a neuroscience department and ask for someone to teach a course to architects. They're not going to have a clue of what they can possibly teach. And similarly, you can't expect architects who have all this other training to master a field that's so far out of it. I think there are really two ways that it's going to push forward, and one of which is through the founding of institutes of research devoted to architecture, where you do have the people with both architectural and neuroscientific backgrounds. And there are several of these being formed today. One in Lausanne I mentioned, I've talked about Galeazzi's work at Parma. He's instituting another section of his team that's going to start being devoted to architecture. We have University College London. There's a Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture in San Diego, but it hasn't quite jumped to, it's still almost at the evidence-based design level, hasn't really jumped to the potential of what this could be. But I think as these institutes are formed and we begin to get the research, it's going to become, in a way, common knowledge to architects without needing a lot of tutoring and understanding to see the results of the research and how it might be effective. I mean, at some point, I thought about this at IIT. I teach sort of seminars touching on some of these points, but I'm not sure how you would really teach a course to everyone on these topics. But I think, again, once the research is being done and it becomes better known, it's almost going to be a kind of a force of its own momentum that pushes forward, and it's going to maybe draw some curricular changes, but I don't see that in the near future right now.
I know you presented some of the general lines of what you're working on, and as such, because they are general lines, one has to also, one follows a general conclusion, at least a general tendencies into which those lines might go. If I understand what you're saying correctly, and I'm including biological argument and so forth, what you wish to establish is sufficient research, sufficient knowledge, let's not use too many technical terms, sufficient knowledge that actually underlies relations, perceptual relations, be subjective relations, or experiences of form. And is it a part of the research to actually think that the reverse is therefore applicable, in the sense that if one researches subjective experiences to objective forms, one is therefore able to design for particular subjective experiences. One is therefore also able to design for a collective set of experiences, which are in a cultural narrative. So I have one question in common. Is that part of what you are?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting line that I don't really like to cross, but people are crossing, and Professor Bermudez, as you know, at Catholic University, is doing precisely that. He's looking at what makes a religious space religious. And so you know, and it's interesting when I talk about emotion. I mean, the only time I think architects think about emotion is when they're designing a religious building or a cemetery or something where it has a strong sort of profound emotional resonance. I mean, obviously people are going to go that direction, and I think it can be of value. I just don't want to try to make it into, you know, some sort of a reductionist response to the world, because I think what all this research really shows is our complexity, and really we have to become more sophisticated and more complex as designers to really to keep up with it. The more we begin to learn.
Yeah, and so you pointed out you're not wanting to reduce this to deterrence.
Yeah.
I know that that's not what you wish to do. Nonetheless, though, the important thing here, maybe you're going in that direction, but might I suggest some feedback to that effect? That when we talk about our relation, our experience of architectural form, outside or inside, or collectively in an urban space, we're always talking about at least three different purposes. I mean, there is the purpose for which a building was made.
Right.
I don't mean its function. I mean the architectural character. The architectural, this is a term that, expression that you and I, you know, I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
We're the person we both admired for a long time. But there is the architectural character that a building ought to have,
Right.
because of its nature, is what it is. And for the example that you gave about the sacred space or sacred building, what is it that is actually sacred about it? What is there sacred about the architecture that actually conveys precisely that sacrality? So there's that purpose. There's the purpose for whomever actually intended that. It might be a parish, it might be a city, it might be an individual. But all of these things are not separate from the architect's self-expression.
Right.
So I would suggest that there's a triangular relationship.
Yeah.
Actually, and that triangular relationship actually is responsive to, in part, for architectural character and our responses, subjective or collective, to those.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. Interesting, and this is one of the things that I didn't show because I'm again very sort of cautious about going into these areas. But there's a very prominent neuroscientist at the University of Toronto who's done literally formal studies of the lines of architectural rooms, and his conclusion was that there's an overwhelming preference for curvilinear forms versus rectilinear forms. And in fact, one particular experiment he designed, there were 3 rooms with curvilinear forms and 3 rooms with all rectilinear forms. And again, I think you can't do that in a serious way, but at the same time, it is sort of curious that they get such a positive result with curvilinear forms over rectilinear forms. So I would never go so far as to suggest that we eliminate straight lines.
Well, if I could respond, we talked about this the other day that I've had the experience of being in the wilderness for a long period of time. And I felt at the end of that stage, you start creating straight lines. And I'm just wondering, presently, our culture is so immersed into an artificial environment where almost everything around us is straight lines, that we actually seek out the novelty of the curvilinear line as a relief. Could that have influenced his results? I'm wondering who took that into account.
Yeah, I mean, like the other night, I don't have an answer for that. Let's go back to the premise of that you like to see straight lines after a few days in the wilderness. Is this because you're an architect by training?
Yeah, that's true.
Would the average, someone untrained? Because usually people, when they go to the mountains or to the seashore for their holidays, they're not really thinking in terms of lines and needing something other than a.
When they go to the seashore, there's artificial things that they're seeing in homes, buildings. I'm talking about you get up in northern Canada or Idaho where you just don't see anything artificial, nothing man-made except you and the person you're traveling with.
Of course, you do have certain trees that have a very straight line, and then you've got the horizon. So I mean, you do have those elements in nature.
Keeping
in keeping on this note, when you talk about curvilinear lines and straight lines, it means the shape of the room or the decoration of the room, because there's the shape of the room and there's the decoration of the room, and these engage.
Yeah.
And keep.
Well, they were just using sort of curved apps like walls with furniture within it, and again curvilinear. So again, I don't trust those types of experiments. I don't know what they really can show, and I think it leaves sort of a false impression when you're trying to oversimplify things. But obviously, it's always I guess research. Bad research is better than no research.
When you go to the museum in Naples and you see the rooms of the Romans with the cubicula with painted perspectives, and how the whole thing worked out on the visual. Some of the spaces were to be closed, some others were to be open, and the whole thing obviously plays and tremendously with the individual. So the shape of the room is part of the issue. It's not the issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
Go ahead.
so is it fair to say that it is at least part of your position that we ought to be thinking about architecture and cities as being in some way commodious and comfortable for human beings? That that somehow there's a set of responses and expectations that we would value in a certain way, and that these things should be in the mind of architects in our design of places. So if that's a premise, and maybe it's not, but if that's a premise, what would you make of architects today who set out explicitly to subvert that? I'll pose that as a question, and then I'll make an observation with respect to a comment you made earlier. It was kind of a throwaway comment, so I don't know if you intended it the way you did. You spoke of improvement in the built environment. And I think one of the interesting things, and I preface this by saying that the science of this and the thinking of this is all fascinating and authoritative and in a certain kind of way convincing. But in evolutionary theory, in its origins, it's not coincidental that it occurred in the 19th century and in the context of historical theories of progress, and the notion of evolution itself implies something teleological. And that teleological sensibility is something that contemporary evolutionary science has left behind, as far as I understand it. So what is interesting to me is that when we talk about improvement in urbanism or improvement in architecture, that does imply the teleological framework.
Yeah, and I never meant to imply that. Again, I go back to the image just before. I mean, we are really, in a way, play. Games are fascinating for us on every level. So I may have used the word improvement, and maybe if we had brought more joy in gaming into things, but no, I really, again, I'm not I'm not really focused on any end to this type of research, and I always emphasize the complexity that we can't do certain things.
No, I think that's an entirely consistent position to take. But I guess then, how would you answer the question about what to make of the architect who sets out to subvert?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously that was a strong part of 20th century cultural or artistic practice. And I was just up as I was waiting to come down here today, reading the still have that emotion, and we're just sort of, in a way, sort of ignoring it. But I mean, we are just basically biological organisms. We're going to respond to everything, that every stimulus that we have. So it's impossible to avoid that unless you go into a coma or really a good night's sleep. But usually there you're dreaming.
Do you think the answer will be the same in 20 years?
About, oh, you mean about that we've changed our emotional systems? Well, I mean, certainly my argument here is that if when we're designing habitats, we're designing ourselves. So yeah, I mean, maybe we can design a world where we're all like 1984 if we, can eliminate all of those social relationships if we really try. But I don't think so. I mean, it just really, I think human nature is, again, using an old term, human nature is still human nature, and you can't really modify it within a few generations. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to ask another question about education in architecture, but I think very much here. So we use drawing and visual kind of, let's say, approaches to think and to explore and to design. Do you think that we need to enlarge our kind of tools to other sensuous strategies or intellectual strategies so that we kind of, is the visual approach sufficient to kind of really get to the heart of emotion?
No, I don't think it is sufficient in and of itself, and I think we should, again, bring in, I mean, good examples are, you have a room that might be very well proportioned in size, and then you have glare coming in at an angle, and you can't see the blackboard. You can't, you really have to take into account, plasma is architecture of the seven senses. One of the senses is muscles and bones. Well, this is actually a very, very sophisticated part of our tactile system where we know when we're in balance, and we know, for instance, if we say we walk into the Pantheon in Rome, we're going to stand taller and breathe more deeply and slow down the rate of respiration. We know we're going to have these sort of physiological responses. So some of those might be visual, but some might be spatial, some might be tactile. There's, walking across a comfortable floor, can give you a bad impression because it doesn't fit the comfort of the feet. But we're pre-consciously aware of that. Well, I mean, our feet know that this is not quite a nice area to walk on. If we're walking on sand in a beach, we know it hurts, and we try to avoid that. Now, I think we really, Alberto Perez Gomez, his book on this, I think is very good because he also, and more recently has by the way, there is a book out that he's got an essay in recently, which is Mind in Architecture, and there was a conference at Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation 2 years ago, which has now come out in a book, and it's edited by Juhani Plasma and Sarah Robinson, who's also worked with, to some extent, with Galeazzi in Italy. It's interesting to see Perez Gomez come into this and, again, really stress the aura, the ambience, these other factors that come into play in the design of a room. So I'd like to get, yeah. Someone else, anybody?
So in Stephen Pinker's Blank Slate,
Yeah.
Trent suggests that the modernist and postmodernist art worlds have really denied the natural nature. Do you think they really kind of support the modernist, postmodernists support their own agendas through a very subjectivist type of foundation? do you think neuroscience, with the authority of the scientific, framework, has the ability to kind of turn the tide of our current state of architectural subjectivity, and if, how would neuroscience contribute to that, and do you think there are other fields that would help facilitate the return to?
Right. Well, I don't like to limit it to neuroscience. I mean, what I was putting up here was really a contemporary cultural theory. I think just the realization that, again, that when we design something, we're really designing ourselves or the environments for, I mean, for our children, grandchildren, whatever, but we're also in a way sort of designing, how the world turns as far as experiences go. So it's an interesting question, because you take someone like Frank Gehry did some really outrageous things early on in his career, and he had enormous influence. So was his influence good or bad? Well, I mean, it was probably interesting the first several times he did this, but then when everyone does the same thing, it becomes, it becomes very, very, very tedious very quickly. So again, it's difficult to really defend. As far as Pinker goes, I'm very, I don't follow a lot of what Pinker concludes. That quote that you're referring to with the tall buildings, I think is a good one, because again, we just assumed we were born into an architectural culture and said this is the way we design our building. I don't think anyone really sat back and thought, well, maybe people don't want to live in those cement boxes up in the sky. And of course, they've been all over the world since they were introduced, and I don't think it has been a very positive thing in any way, shape, or form. So I think he was in a way correct there, but again, I'm suspicious sometimes of the evolutionary biologists when they try to take a step too far.
Okay. Sure, we have a reception next door, so you're all invited to that. And Harry, I'd like to thank you very much. You've generated more questions than we've had for a while for this talk. So